a cultural. Okay, got it. Recording now in progress. So thank you all so much for joining us for the ASA section on cultural sociology's series, Culture and Contemporary Life. This is panel 1, and we're looking at culture across the discipline. We have a fabulous set of panelists. I'm Dr. Jessie K. Finch. I'm the chair at Northern Arizona University in the sociology department. My fellow co-moderator, Adriana Munson, was actually not able to attend today. She had some other crazy pressing things that came up. So we do have Michael Johnston here with us, who I think, Michael, you've been on this committee for 2 years, 3 years?
Yes, this is my second year.
All right, awesome. So we're both really excited you're here, and we appreciate everyone coming. I dropped the info here. The goal of this panel is to think about the ways that sociologists all across the discipline, not just folks who consider themselves cultural sociologists, but any and all sociologists think about theories from cultural sociology or integrate our diverse disciplinary perspectives. I know I always pitch to students that the great thing about sociology is that there is a sociology of, you get to fill in that blank. And so thinking about it in that way, we're thinking about the ways that are different subspecialties. ASA has over 80 subsections, discuss how they successfully integrate theories from cultural sociology as well as other areas. So the order we're going to go in today is going to be Pamela, Derron, Allison with a Y, and Allison with an I. And then we're going to open it up to Q&A and have some exciting conversations together. There any questions before we get started? Right. Well, with that, I will hand it over to Pamela. She is a fabulous young sociologist who focuses on migration, racial stratification, and she told me that she even went and watched some previous series to prepare for this. So let's give Pamela a huge round of applause. Yay!
Hey, hi, everybody. It is such an honor to be here today. It's especially a unique honor to be going first at something because as a Z, I am always at the end. So thank you to the organizers of the Culture and Contemporary Life series for putting this together. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you all today. Thank you also to the Sociology of Culture section of the American Sociological Association for having me here to speak about my work. So I am a qualitative researcher of race and ethnicity and of migration. And so I focus on racial meaning, the construction of racial meanings, and specifically ideas around what it means to be Black and what it means to be Latinx, how those categories, how those identities, how they're collectively constructed and contested by people who specifically sit at the intersection of those two identities, so people who are Black and Latinx. And I also focus on how people construct and contest these ideas transnationally. So I think about beyond the US context, which is something that sociology doesn't always do without a little bit of pushing. I think beyond the US context, to think about Latin America as well, and the transmission of these ideas between the regions, and following, of course, the movement of people from one to the other and back. So I also think about the process of sort of race making and in the context of diaspora. So between members of a nation who are spread across multiple localities and multiple contexts. And I specifically look at how meanings are mobilized in the service of ideas about who, for example, is a real Black person, who is a real Latinx person. So this idea of ethno-racial authenticity. Who gets to decide who is a real Latinx person, who is a real Black person? What does that even mean? How does context play a role in how those things are defined, right? And how are those notions of authenticity contested and negotiated between people who may or may not fit whatever the normative construction of an authentic identity is, those who are on the margins of these identities? So throughout the rest of my time, I'm going to be briefly talking about 2 projects where this question of authenticity and belonging shows up. And I love that this is specifically called sort of culture and sociology at the margins, because that's exactly where a lot of my research is coming from. And my work is really firmly situated at the intersection of a lot of fields. So I do a lot of reading outside of sociology as well to think about Latinx populations in the US and Latin America, Black studies, migration, identity, culture, transnational race studies, social movements, and so on. And as I said earlier, most of my research is focused specifically on the experiences of Afro-Latinx people and the construction of Afro-Latinidad or Afro-Latinx identity in the US. And I focus on that group because I think it offers a really good opportunity to understand the racialization and identity contestations that happen both within and between Blackness and Latinidad, which are often seen and constructed as completely separate groups that do not overlap. They're mutually exclusive. You're either Black or you're Latinx, you're not both. And they've been constructed that way partially because this collective that we know as Latinx has been constructed as pan-ethnic and racially homogenous, and they're not white, they're not Black, they're just kind of in this ambiguous racial middle, not really fitting into either. But what that does is that actually obscures the fact that there are differently racialized members of this group who have vastly different racial experiences, both in the US and in Latin America. There are white Latinx people, there are Black Latinx people, and there are Latinx people that can be racialized in any number of ways in between. And so conversely, thinking about what it means to be Black in the United States, right? There's a very rich sociological literature on Black migration. And a lot of it has focused on these contentions about, do Black immigrants want to be Black? Like, why don't they want to call themselves Black? Like, even though within a generation or two, their socioeconomic outcomes are essentially the same as the general Black population of the United States as Black Americans, like, what is this contention that exists with these identity labels and with Blackness in particular? And so a lot of research that has shown that there's also, in addition to being these normative ideas about what it means to be Latinx in the United States, there's normative ideas about what it means to be Black in the United States. And those ideas are rooted in a very particular Black American experience that can be traced back to the particular institution of US slavery. Slavery was a hemispheric global phenomenon, but the US had its iteration of it. It can be traced through the historical process of Reconstruction, Jim Crow segregation, the Civil Rights Movement, and so on, and the particular state violences that continue to be implemented against the Black American community to the present day in the post-civil rights period. And so a lot of what I look at in my work is how are those particular histories and cultural understandings about what Black culture is in the United States and Black history mobilized in such a way that they essentially become boundaries around what Blackness is and who can claim it. And the way that I approach it, as I said earlier, is through this Afro-Latinx community. And so in my current project, which is my dissertation and hopefully future book project, I do take on this question of Black ethno-racial authenticity. And the story I like to start with is, if anybody's a baseball fan who has maybe been following the historical trajectory of race in baseball, you'll know that in the past like 10 or 15 years or so, the number of African-American baseball players has dwindled compared to the heyday of this population playing baseball several decades ago. And as that population has grown smaller, the population of Afro-Latinx baseball players has increased because MLB has increasingly drawn from Latin America for players. And so I start one of my dissertation chapters off with these examples of these Black American baseball players who say things like, well, these Dominican players, these Puerto Rican players, they aren't real Black people. They're imposters. They're fake Black people, right? And so that got me thinking, like seeing those stories and reading those comments got me thinking, well, like what even is a real Black person? And what is it about Blackness from Latin America, Blackness from other parts of the world that gets it read as fake or an imposter version of Blackness in the United States? And so in the field of cultural studies, there's this notion of hegemonic Blackness, which is essentially tells us that Blackness as it is understood in the United States through the sheer imperial impositions of the United States and the world, through the transmission of US culture, of Black American culture specifically, to other parts of the world, Black American Blackness has become sort of a measuring stick against which to measure other Blacknesses. And so when you think about these players who are calling African-American players, Afro-Puerto Rican players, fake Black people, it's because their version of Blackness, the Blackness that they represent from another part of the world, does not necessarily measure up to this concept of Blackness that we have here in the United States, so this very particular history and culture that we draw from when we think about Blackness and Black Americanness in the United States. And so for my project, I interview Dominicans in the United States, actually, first 1.5 and second generation Dominicans. And I went with that group specifically because if anyone follows sort of the diaspora war discourse on Twitter, I'm not calling it X, you sort of know that groups like Dominicans are sort of in the middle of these contentions about, well, they don't want to be Black. They don't want to call themselves Black. Are they really Black? There's celebrities like Cardi B who are constantly being thrown into this like meat grinder of this discourse that happens at this point, I think just about every week. It's actually very annoying to see. But so I essentially take on this question of like, what are these diaspora wars? Like, what is it that we're actually fighting about? When we're creating this meaning around Blackness and who identifies as what and what those identifications mean. And so in the chapter that I introduce with the story about the baseball players, I go on to sort of demonstrate beyond just this question of yes or no, do you identify as Black? What does identifying as Black actually mean to you? And what does it mean to you in the context of, so what I found is that a lot of my respondents who are Black identifying Dominicans or Afro-Latinx, Afro-Dominicans, they run into a lot of moments where, as opposed to them denying their Blackness and saying, no, I'm not Black, they say, yes, I am Black, but then other people tell them that they're not Black. Their Blackness is denied to them as opposed to being denied by them. And so I really wanted to dig into those moments in particular because it kind of flips around what we think about usually when we think about these Black immigrant contentions of Blackness, is what happens when they do accept a version of Blackness, but then they are told by others in these sort of negotiations around identity that they are actually not Black, that those denials are imposed on them. And so it's things like, I have examples of respondents who go to join Black student unions at their colleges or go to join Black organizations that are just called like Black Student Union, and they assume that that includes them, but then when they enter these spaces, they're not included, they don't feel included for a number of reasons, or they're told that they don't necessarily belong in those spaces. One particular example that really stands out to me from this chapter that I then connect to another chapter on social movements and anti-racist movements in the United States and Latin America is one respondent who she went to join, actually, she's a community organizer, and she went to join a organizing space around Black Lives Matter movement in 2020. And when she arrived at that space, she was told, well, Dominicans don't think they're Black, what are you doing here? And so she had to undergo this and to go through this entire negotiation with the people in the space. And she said, I just ended up leaving because my Blackness as I was bringing it into the space wasn't necessarily welcome. And so the caveat that I always give when I talk about this work is I'm not necessarily trying to approach this from a space of, well, they said and they said, like, I'm not trying to necessarily pit any particular ethnic group against each other within this umbrella of Blackness. What I'm essentially just trying to show is how exactly it is that this collectivity that we know as Black, like how identities are negotiated within that space. And a lot of my respondents actually allude to a desire for more diasporic understandings of Blackness, right? So I identify two ways that they respond to these denials. One of which is, I call it internalization, which is essentially, they essentially accept these narratives that they're hearing about how they aren't Black, and then they take them in and use them to police their own Blackness and the Blackness of other Afro-Dominicans and other Afro-Latinx people. And I find that they actually lead to a lot of really like negative feelings and emotions around their Blackness. I had a respondent, for example, who said, I don't feel like I can, even though I identify as a Black Latino woman, I don't feel like I can check off Black on a form because I feel like I'm taking something away from someone else. I feel like the experience that is represented by this box is not my experience, but then I don't know where to put myself. And then the converse of this internalization is sort of what I call reassertion, which is ways in which respondents are able to sort of reassert their Blackness despite these denials. So when people have their Blackness denied to them, they'll say things like, well, no, actually, even though you're telling me that I'm not Black in this way, I am Black. I'm just Black in this more diasporic way. So they sort of invoke a more, a broader understanding of what Blackness can be. And a term that came up a lot in my discussions was umbrella of Blackness, which I really, really love. Which is just people really trying to get away from these really context-specific and narrow understandings of what Blackness is. And conversely, in another project, I take on similar questions, but about what it means to be Latinx and like authentically Latinx and whatever that it is that means. And in both of these projects, I essentially find that people, Black Latinx people, are kind of get the worst of both hands, because in Latinx spaces, which are very anti-Black, like they're culturally premised on the notion of anti-Blackness, Latinx spaces in Latin America, they are racialized as Black, and so they are sort of at the bottom of the racial hierarchy, and with all of the associations that we as sociologists kind of know that comes with. But then, and when they're in Black spaces, and I use Black broadly here, they are also sort of marginalized because of their ethnicity. So it's essentially trying to reconcile the multiple negotiations that these Black immigrants groups have to undergo. And I think that these conversations are especially important for a lot of reasons. Probably the principal one being that the US is only continuing to diversify both racially and ethnically. There are 6 million Afro-Latinx people in the United States. When we think about what the future of coalition building is going to look like, when you look at what the future of political organizing, social organizing is going to look like to what extent does it serve to have these sort of ethnic divisions within these racial spaces, especially like more recently, we have been having a lot of conversations about racial justice. What does it mean that particular groups that exist at an intersection of two identities that aren't seen as potentially overlapping or working with each other, what does it mean that they're essentially being excluded? And so I think I'm going to sort of wrap up there, but I'm happy to talk a little bit more about any of that later on in the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pamela. Really appreciate that. Lots of fascinating points there for sure. So great. With that, I will pass the baton over to Derron.
Good afternoon to you all. What an honor it is to be a part of this space and to see so many of you, including folks some of you I don't know, some of you I do know, and I've read your work and admired them, looking at folks like Zawadi, who I know on the sort of Twitter streets, as they'd say, through to David Deal, whose work I've been reading recently, Jean Beeman, who's been a mentor and a dear colleague for a number of years, to Allison Pugh's work that I've read and admired for a very long time. So it's great to be in this space with you all. I want to spend some time today talking with you about culture across the disciplines, yes, but I want to do so by sharing my screen first and also by zooming into the purpose of, or the focus for my discussion today. I want to talk with you or base my remarks for the next 15 minutes or so on my new book, The Culture Trap, Ethnic Expectations and Unequal Schooling for Black Youth. In particular, I want to zoom in on race, power, and the allure of culture for understanding Black youth in schools. I'm a cultural sociologist of race, ethnicity, and education, and my analysis of culture brings me to institutions to better understand how culture is both understood and reproduced in those contexts. The core argument that drives the book and that I'll elaborate on is that the overemphasis on culture as a secret to student success or failure in schools, it's not only tricky, it's a trap. Discursively and politically, one that pits minoritized groups against one another often in the name of culture, all the while leaving the structures of white domination in place. I came to this study not as, there are apparently babies that are born who immediately know that they're going to be cultural sociologists. I am not one of them. What I will say to you is I came to the study of culture broadly, owing to a challenge, a problem, a puzzle that really arrested me, that ushered my mind down a previously unfamiliar corridor and forced me to wrestle with both the meaning of culture, the mechanisms that sustain it, and also the contestations around it. I one day stumbled upon or had a conversation with a Black teacher that I'd worked with in South London for quite some time. The book is a cross-national comparison between London and New York City schools. And at this time, I was in London doing community organizing work. And this Black teacher, this veteran Black teacher with salt and pepper hair, parted and plaited with a timeless arithmetic, welcomed me to the school as she normally did with a warm embrace. And Miss Bell reminded me, as she almost always did, that she has been teaching for as long as I've been alive. On our way up the stairs to her class, she asked about my work, and I told her, among many, many other things at that time, that I studied at the University of Cambridge. And what followed was a really puzzling conversation that I want to share with you through a non-traditional mode of engagement, if you all don't mind. So bear with me just 1 second. I'm going to share my screen once more, but there's a different way I want to tell you the story about my engagement with Miss Bell. And we'll do so momentarily. I imagine you're not able to hear.
About how Have you ever wondered about how culture shapes students' success or failure in schools? I have. My journey to find answers to this complex but seemingly simple question began years ago on what seemed an otherwise ordinary winter morning in South London. That day, the frost in the air was plain to see if you uttered but a word. The chill of the crisp morning breeze brought warmth to the hearts of some, smiling, strolling, and scurrying by. At least, so it seemed. This otherwise ordinary morning led to an extraordinary moment when I arrived at a local primary school to see students I had worked with for nearly a year on a street safety campaign. A black teacher with salt and pepper hair I call Miss Bell welcomed me with a warm embrace. Miss Bell reminded me, as she always did, that she has been teaching for as long as I have been alive. On our way up the stairs to her class, Miss Bell asked about my work. I told her, among many, many other things, that I studied at the University of Cambridge. "And you're Caribbean?" she asked with an unmistakably sharp Jamaican accent as she spun around with knitted brows, squinted eyes, and that look my mother gives me if I dare tell a lie in her hearing. I responded in the affirmative, and for what felt like all too long, Miss Bell searched my face intently, as if in disbelief. "Caribbean people don't get into Cambridge," she continued. "Africans, maybe," she said, "but not Caribbean young people." I slowed my strides. "In the US, Caribbean people usually do well," I said. Miss Bell took me by my hand, pointed down the hall toward her classroom, and said, "Not in England, my friend." An awkward silence followed us down the hallway until a group of 8 to 9-year-olds shouted, "Mr. Wallace! Mr. Wallace!" As I stepped into the classroom, I couldn't help but wonder if Miss Bell's perceptions were true. When I next met Miss Bell, this time outside of a church where she co-directed a Saturday supplementary school, she seemed perplexed by our previous conversation too. "Is what you told me about Caribbean people in the US really a thing?" she asked, confessing that she had never heard claims of Caribbean success in the United States. She wondered aloud, "What caused Caribbean people to be successful there and not here?" I insisted that Caribbean success in the United States was not universal, but contextual at best. I told Miss Bell that in cities like New York, Black Caribbean people developed and defended a reputation of being hardworking and committed to education, all in pursuit of the American dream. I then questioned her about Caribbean disadvantage in Britain and its causes. "They keep talking about what's bad about Caribbean culture and Caribbean people," she said. "But how could it be our culture when people with Caribbean culture have different results in different countries?" I asked. "And that me I wonder," Miss Bell replied. This cultural dilemma captivated me. Something about the curious paradox of Caribbean achievement gave me clarity and sparked restless curiosity. This book, The Culture Trap, ethnic expectations and unequal schooling for Black youth is the result of that moving, memorable exchange with Miss Bell. It is my answer to looming questions about the role of culture in shaping students' educational achievement. What I learned is that the use of culture to explain Black students' success or failure in schools is not only tricky, it is a trap.
I'll pause it there for now as a primer of sorts into the very project that resulted in this book. As I noted previously, the core arguments I wish to advance in this presentation and in the book, really the core argument in the book is that the overemphasis on culture, that culture matters, but not separate and aside from social structure, that it's best understood in history. And the resources I could use to address this problem, I couldn't simply draw on the tools of cultural sociology to do it. I had to draw on the sociology of education. I had to draw on the sociology of race and ethnicity. I had to draw on sociology of immigration. And it's at the interstices of these fields that I was able to pull together an analysis that I share with you all in this book. So I'm going to share my screen once more. So what is this puzzle? Following the discussion I had with Ms. Bell, I realized actually that this difference that we noted in the book really mattered. There was a curious paradox between the framing, historical and contemporary framing of Black Caribbean students' achievement in London and New York City, in the US and the UK. Since the 1920s, Black Caribbeans have been deemed a high-achieving Black model minority in the United States relative to African Americans, whereas in the UK context since the 1960s, they've been purported as the persistently underachieving minority. In both national contexts, however, it is purported that there's something intrinsic to their culture that produces these outcomes. Well, this cross-national study calls into question the significance of culture and spotlights the importance of national policy context, the order of Black migration, and a range of other structural and historical factors alongside culture in shaping the divergent outcomes of the same ethnic group. I realized that what Ms. Bell had to say was very much informed by data, and that led me to understand the puzzle of the Caribbean achievement paradox. I pull here data from 2008-2009 academic year and the 2012-2013 academic year when I began fieldwork. And you will see that they're comparing GCSE or national exam data for students by race and ethnicity. With more time, I could walk you through this in greater detail, but you will see all groups have improved from the blue bars in 1 year to the red bars for 2012-2013. However, I want to call your attention to this portion where my cursor is moving, where you will note that Black Caribbean students are at the bottom of this sort of achievement hierarchy, as it were, and that the only other group that fares less well than they do are traveler, Gypsy, and Roma populations. And we know that owing to their migration patterns, they often experience inconsistent schooling, and that impacts the results. However, for Black Caribbean students across the British context, and particularly in London, that go to school on a regular basis, they consistently rank amongst the students with the lowest scores. It is difficult to get the kind of data in the United States that we gleaned or that I shared with you just now, but I pulled data from the current population survey to show the educational achievement, particularly in New York City in this case. And what I want to call your attention to quickly here is that you will notice West Indians or Black Caribbeans, those from the English-speaking Caribbean to be clear. And if you pay attention to the barred portion here, the line portion here, you will see that it represents those with graduate and professional degrees. But look at the dotted portion in particular between Caribbean immigrants and those with a bachelor's degree relative to the second generation. Look at the significance that a greater share of the second generation actually than the first generation achieves a bachelor's degree, and compare them to Hispanics in New York City, to Asians in New York City, to whites in New York City, and to African Americans in New York City. The data, once again, reaffirmed this puzzle and forced me to think meaningfully about what explains this. In the book, I do two things, or there are two main sections of the book. In the first part, I note that immigration histories and urban education policies matter for framing the divergent representations of Black Caribbeans in the United States and the United Kingdom. As a point of example, it is not merely their culture that matters, but immigration laws, the United States case, for instance, the immigration laws of 1917 necessitated that the Black Caribbeans coming to the United States context had to be highly proficient in English. And what that became a code for was a way of recruiting the middle classes and the elite who then came to New York City and were not represented as middle class and elite Black Caribbean people. They were represented, or their success was wholly represented as a matter of their culture. That is what I refer to in the book as the secret life of social class. You think this is merely and solely or singularly a matter of culture, when in many respects, social class plays a profound role in the representation of cultures we see across varied national contexts. I also examine the importance of understanding the sort of post-colonial historical context. I challenge immigration studies scholarship here to suggest that we cannot understand immigrants simply by focusing on them in their host society. We must understand the perception of immigrants, Black Caribbean immigrants, and I would argue all immigrants. We must understand their perception of the host society from the homeland. And what that ushers in is that post-colonial critique that was a signature feature of Stuart Hall's analysis of culture, which I will come to later on. Schooling, I'm arguing, or schools in particular, are cultural institutions that long after the collapse of colonialism, long after nation states in the Caribbean have ushered in levels of independence, national independence, that is, these schools often still traffic a set of assumptions about what achievement looks like and about where schooling is better. And parents in particular really struggled with this, in that many of them, owing to their schooling in the Caribbean, believed that what was British was better. I can unpack that for you all later on too. But inside of schools for the young people, I realized that academic ability grouping was a signature institutional mechanism shaping ethnic expectations and reinforcing the culture trap. Critically, I note 3 cultural strategies that Black Caribbean students use on both sides of the Atlantic in pursuit of success. The first is distinctiveness, this belief that they're somehow different from, and in some cases better than, another ethno-racial group. The next is deference, the belief, and I should note that distinctiveness in this case, I note as a classed formulation. Deference in this case is this belief that your behavior, your comportment, how you speak, how you walk, will impact your success. And that I come to understand is a gendered formulation. And the last is defiance. What happens when young people in schools recognize, and I quote, as one young person in the study said in New York City, that they are using our culture against us. Young people, I find, are savvy political actors, ready in key cases to stand up and challenge elements of racial inequality when they encounter them. Critically for this book, it is informed by what I consider an uncommon theoretical connection. I bring the classic person or theorist that many of us in cultural sociology draw on, Pierre Bourdieu. I was trained in the UK context where I can say a whole lot about the sort of rampant Bourdieu worship that shapes that national context and the study of sociology within it. But I also bring into plain view the work of Stuart Hall, who many often sideline and recognize or fail to recognize that he was a sociologist. In fact, he was the president of the British Sociological Association in the 1990s. And I bring both of their work into conversation. There's a lot they have in common. Both eschewed or challenge theoretical theory or theory for its own sake or theory for textbooks. Both thought of themselves as outsiders within, based on their positionality in different ways. But critically, Bourdieu engaged with schools in his analysis of culture, but not race. Hall analyzed culture and race, but not in the context of schools. By bringing them together, it provides me with a richer lens through which to understand the work of culture in the context of schools. For both Stuart Hall and Bourdieu, critically, I think through the work of colonialism, not simply as a racialized or class modality of power influenced by geographical, political, institutional arrangements in the Caribbean, but as a global networked arrangement, right? And to understand that global networked arrangement, it means we must also understand that network shaping the meaning-making of parents, not only in the Caribbean, but even immigrant parents from the Caribbean in New York City and in London, within these global cities. What does this all mean? As an example, here's how that understanding of culture within the context of sort of a comparative historical context of understanding colonialism, why it matters. What accounts for the differences between Black Caribbeans in London and New York City? I note that Black Caribbeans in Britain were primary subjects of British colonialism, oriented by Caribbean schools or in Caribbean schools and society to think of Britain as another home. Black Caribbean people who've come to the United States, on the other hand, are secondary subjects of US settler colonialism, right? Relatively newcomers striving in the United States. And to go back to Stuart Hall, this different relational positioning in the United States and the UK context matters for their representation in the culture, in the national political arena and discursive spaces. It led me to theorize the culture trap, which I argue is a unifying analytical framework for understanding the diverse but related misrepresentations of racialized minorities, all based on the common thread of culture. What does that mean? Plainly, we have a tremendous amount of research paying attention to the experiences or to the influence of the model minority myth on British Asians and select groups of Asian Americans. We have a fair amount of work and critique of the culture of poverty thesis, which there's not enough time for me to note a critical analysis of that, but there's so many folks who've done this work prior. And its use, particularly in relation to African-American families in the late 1960s. And curiously, this same narrative, this culture of poverty thesis, leaves the United States and goes to the United Kingdom in the early 1970s to frame Black Caribbean families in the same way. What we're not recognizing across this sort of framing, cultural framing of the model minority myth and the culture of poverty thesis, is that it keeps these minoritized groups and the challenge, the yoking of culture separate. I argue in this work that recognizing the common threads, the common misuses of culture to sort of bind, yoke, minoritize or marginalize minoritized groups, pardon me, that recognition is critical for building coalitions and challenging racism, which dovetails so wonderfully with what Pamela said before. So in closing, going back to the key points, in this work, I bring together the sociology of culture, drawing on the rich tools of Stuart Hall and Pierre Bourdieu to give us a robust analysis of understanding culture within geopolitical, colonial, and historical contexts. And I bring that into the context of schools, thinking of schools as cultural institutions. But I also focus in there on the experiences of Black youth and their meaning-making, particularly second-generation Black Caribbean youth, which allows me to work across the 5 fields noted on the screen. It is culture across the disciplines. To note, I had to learn in the context of this book that culture matters, but not separate and aside from social structure. To learn more, I'd love to say more in the Q&A and to talk with you more about the book, but for now, I yield the floor and I say thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Derron, for the multi-media version of that awesome story as well. Okay, so next up we have Allison, who's going to talk with us a little bit about decolonizing self-care.
Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Spurgas, and I'm getting over a bit of an illness, so my throat's a little sore, so apologies for my voice. I'm going to try to make it through without going into a coughing fit. I am going to share my screen in a moment, but I just wanted to say I am actually not a cultural sociologist by training, so I'm very much at the borders and the margins, and I'm excited to be here. I think particularly maybe because of that. I'm really a sociologist of medicine and science, race, class, gender, and sexuality, with a particular interest in technologies of care and intersectional feminist science studies, science and technology studies. So just really quickly, I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, can everybody see this? Okay, wonderful. Okay, so I'm just going to get right into it in the interest of time. So over the last few decades, terms such as wellness and self-care, I'm going to switch to this slide actually, because I think it really encapsulates what I'm talking about here with this mindfulness white lady. She's balancing many different things. So terms such as wellness and self-care have become more common in households across wealthy countries, such as the United States. And these days, the whole idea of self-care is most commonly associated with individualized and indulgent activities that people, particularly cis women, do or are expected to do because we deserve it. This includes things like taking a bath, getting a massage, meditating, going to yoga, going on a vacation, or even sleeping late. Self-care has also become synonymous with its expression on social media. Such posts and tweets might include a photo of the self-care doing some type of pampering activity. Maybe she bought a special beverage at Starbucks, for example, along with the hashtag self-care Sunday, or maybe it's self-care Saturday. I can't keep up anymore. So in this brief discussion today, I will highlight some of these new self-care trends, specifically in relation to femininity, whiteness, neoliberalism, and cultural appropriation. Connecting all of them, hopefully, to theoretical frameworks that emerge from cultural sociology. I'm going to start by reading just a brief excerpt from my recent book, Decolonize Self-Care, pictured here. This is co-authored with Zoe Malio-Irwin for OR Press and published in 2023. And the short section that I'm going to read is from chapter 2, which is called Marketing Self-Care, from Femtech and Biohacking to Pain Moons and Extreme Travel. And I just wanted to say that the cover of this book is not the most beautiful, but when you see it as part of the series, it actually fits right in. It's a lovely kind of rainbow of colors. Okay, so today self-care and wellness are big business. The global wellness economy was valued at $4.9 trillion in 2019 and then fell to $4.4 trillion in 2020, primarily due to the widespread impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. In a hopefully one day post-pandemic world, the wellness economy is projected to grow at 9.9% annually, reaching nearly $7 trillion in 2025. The wellness economy continues to expand faster than global economic growth. So this is just a bit about that kind of political economic picture. I am going to skip ahead a little bit here. So self-care and wellness products, including those that are sometimes referred to as Eastern or indigenous, are increasingly designed by, produced by, and bought and sold to wealthy white women. But the association of self-care with elite white cis femininity is more than this. These industries utilize femininity in terms of both the content, so what is sold, and the form, how it is sold, in marketing these products as well. E-commerce and new marketing styles and techniques change relationships between consumers, producers, and products. That is, they change how and why people buy. In this new women-friendly business world, self-care products and services are sold in an aspirational manner. Certainly, advertising has always manufactured needs and wielded aspirational content in order to drive sales. So that's not necessarily new. The old idiom, keeping up with the Joneses, comes to mind. But what Zoe and I argue in the book is that what is new is this kind of framing of all of this as both inspirational and aspirational, and the way that there is this kind of attempt to approximate or substitute for this shared wisdom of women's communities and networks, and a kind of co-optation of the radical politics, or kind of a very superficial framing of the radical politics of care and self-care discourses of times past and of earlier social movements. So women's self-care today specifically is a highly lucrative market, and monetized self-care is often in another contortion linked to descriptions of ancient or sacred femininity, which clearly connects all of this to themes of co-optation, appropriation, and neoliberal optimization. There are also innumerable examples of extremely profitable companies today that target women's sexuality and desire, and emphasize the importance. Oh, and this is a yoni egg. This looks, I know, a little offensive, but it's actually it's not as offensive as it may first appear. But this is a yoni egg, and this is an example of the kind of product that might be sold to a woman in this vein. So there are these numerous examples, and they target women's sexuality and desire, and often emphasize the importance of female sexual empowerment. So being sexually empowered and having good sex are subtly positioned as feminine responsibilities or duties toward conviviality, generosity, and hospitality, but including to oneself. So there is something here about this kind of self-optimization as well. And mindfulness is often the vehicle or modality to achieve these ends. And that's something we do focus on in the book, particularly in the chapters on gender and sexuality. Mindfulness, tantra, the kind of co-optation of these things are very prominent. So sexual well-being then is most certainly a through line from the more medically legitimate sphere to the more popular self-help sphere. And as we argue in the book, the medical, complementary alternative, and commodified self-help spheres are actually not so separate anymore. They kind of blend often together, including through the social media kind of world. So one notorious example that has received a ton of attention over the last decade and critical scrutiny for its eventually revealed cult-like and multi-level marketing or pyramid scheme status is One Taste. After being investigated by the FBI for sex trafficking, prostitution, and violations of labor law beginning in 2018, One Taste shut its doors, but it has rebranded itself as the Institute of Om. And I will explain the significance of the term Om here. So founded by Nicole Derron in San Francisco in the early 2000s, and that is this woman who's pictured here, One Taste came to define itself as a business dedicated to researching and teaching the practices of slow sex and orgasmic meditation, or OM, a trademark procedure that typically involves a cisgender man using a gloved, lubricated fingertip to stroke a cisgender woman's clitoris for approximately 15 minutes. I don't know what the significance of the 15 minutes is, but that is the actual time that is suggested. Though it embraces certain tenets based in Eastern philosophy, One Taste's central focus has been on female orgasm and sexuality, especially through this technique of what they call OM. During the company's rapid ascent and before its very quick crash, the San Francisco and later LA and New York City-based company made $12 million in revenue in 2017, and then it began to expand and really ramp up its revenue to cities like Atlanta, Chicago, Minneapolis, and Washington. It also partnered with companies like Odwalla, and according to former CEO Joanna Van Vleck, quoted in an article by Ellen Hewitt for Bloomberg Businessweek, One Taste is the Whole Foods of sexuality, the organic, good-for-you version. One Taste is perhaps an outlier in the wellness arena, having been the subject of so much public criticism for being a sex cult / Ponzi scheme, and now undergoing investigation by the FBI due to these trafficking allegations. But the group's notoriety clearly demonstrates how sexual fulfillment, and specifically female pleasure, becomes something to be capitalized upon in pseudo-medical or quasi-medical spaces. This capitalization not only sells products, but is also an example of a lifestyle built around calling up, utilizing, and instrumentalizing heterosexual desire and gynocentric cis feminine pleasure. This always be optimizing mentality regarding the productive nature of female sexuality is made clear in a TED Talk featuring Nicole Derron, recorded in 2011, well before the sex cult and multi-level marketing scandal part of the story made international news. Throughout the talk, Derron emphasizes the notion that enhancing female pleasure is not only good for women, it's good for men, it's good for families, it's good for the whole world. So I think that's kind of this important piece that we flesh out, this healthy women equals healthy populations, healthy nation states, and healthy markets. This is a refrain echoed by many in the mindful sex and sexual wellness sphere, but it's really hammered home by Derron in her early talk entitled Orgasm, the Cure for Hunger in the Western Woman, which at the time of this writing has been viewed almost 2.5 million times on YouTube. In it, Derron describes how female orgasm is vital for every single woman on the planet, that it's not so bad for the guys either, and that it roots our fundamental capacity for connection. The women who come to One Taste, they are clamoring to be sated and chanting the Western woman's mantra. I work too hard, I eat too much, I diet too much, I drink too much, I shop too much, I give too much. And still there is this sense of hunger that I can't touch. So it's very poetic, obviously. This elite whitewashed sexual difference discourse reverberates throughout Derron's talk, and binary gender stereotypes make up the underlying foundation. She describes how she learned the OM technique from a man at a party who stroked the upper left quadrant of her clitoris, seemingly in a kind of meditative, non-sexual way. It's kind of how she describes it. Nothing happened at the time because she was too in her head, but the whole experience made her cry. And this man made something begin to thaw in her because she had never been looked at or felt that kind of compassion before. Again, this is a common refrain across discourses. The modern woman is too stressed out and too busy multitasking to be able to connect with her own natural, free-flowing physiological sexual arousal. But sexual pleasure is her birthright, and pursuing it is an integral form of self-care. She deserves maximum sexual awesomeness, damn it. Derron ends the talk by describing how female pleasure will save the planet. She references the Dalai Lama, now which may be somewhat questionable. She says that the Dalai Lama has said that it will be Western woman who changes the world. She acknowledges that this is a controversial statement because it presumes that Western women are above other women in terms of changing the world. Derron, however, has a different issue with it. She thinks that it will be turned on women around the world and those who dare to stroke us who will actually change the world by feeding this desire for connection that we all have. So here we have a blueprint for how sexual pleasure purportedly will heal women, men, and possibly even the earth itself. So this is the kind of discourse that runs through a lot of what we talk about in the book. So we talk about gender, sexuality, tantra, mindfulness, and then we also have a chapter on mindful eating, food, diet, that's a very important market in this area as well. So to end, I'll just say, I hope it's clear how all of this connects to the culture and contemporary life series, how this connects to issues in cultural sociology. And I don't think it's even really at the boundaries. Just in the last 2 weeks, I've received emails alerting me to the benefits of longevity and health span focused travel, Ozempic and Wegovy for weight loss, menopause retreats in exotic locations, the wellness real estate boom, but simultaneous stalling out of the CBD industry, and alternative health, wellness, and fitness modalities for one's pets. The health and wellness market continues to expand and seems to pervade every aspect of our everyday lives, at least in the global north. And I think what's important for a discussion of culture, and this is where I will end, is that all of this exists right next to the widespread famine, human rights abuses, genocide, murder of trans kids, and the demolition of reproductive rights. From outlawing of abortion to IVF technologies. And all of this is in our social media feed. And all of it, I think, is arguably the stuff of culture today. And this irony is obviously heavy and hideous. The good news is that another important part of culture is how many people are going back to the radical roots of self-care. So obviously, Audre Lorde is someone to cite here, although we cite many other people. Or even just care without all of the self, which is kind of where we end. And many people today are organizing toward mutual aid, grassroots support for marginalized communities, peace and justice, and other modes of material and cultural decolonizing. So we do end with this. We end on a happier note. And my co-author and I discuss all of this in Decolonized Self-Care, and I'd be happy to discuss future directions in this more hopeful vein in the Q&A. I realize that we are running out of time, however. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Allison. Really fascinating work. And we'll move right along in the sake of time for Allison P.
Hi, can you hear me? Great, good. It's kind of interesting because our direction from the organizers, I can see how we all interpreted it a little differently. And I don't have a PowerPoint, but I loved the book trailer, and I actually remember it from when it was originally released, and I really want to know how to get one of those because it's so terrific. It's really gripping and wonderful. I interpreted the, I agree, Jesse. Instead, I interpreted the directions to be a little more meta. So that's what I'm going to give you, and it's not very long. So we'll have a little bit of me, and then we'll go right into Q&A. So we were asked to think about how you see your work interweaving the sociology of culture, other areas of sociology, and or other disciplines and current social issues. So in general, I find myself unusual for the circuitous journey I took to sociology. I started as a journalist. I was in advertising. I worked in the Foreign Service. I started a charter school. These are not normal paths to being a professor. And it made me especially appreciative of the professor's job and the control we have over our time. And I'm quite frank about how I think this is, the last best job, as someone else once called it. And I'm also pretty unusual for my active engagement in many different subfields. One could say that that's a refusal to stay in my lane. That's reflected in my ASA involvement. I've been the chair of 3 different sections. Has that happened to anyone else? And not anyone that I've ever met. So I'm sure in the past at some point, but yeah, and I belong, as I'm sure actually many of you do, to many more. And that has exposed me to people all over the discipline. So I've been really impressed by the sheer breadth of the discipline and our capacity to bring sociology to bear on so many different issues and populations. And the other thing that I'm very proud, thank you, Derron. The other thing I'm very proud of our discipline for is our methodological openness, our omnivorousness. Other fields, other social science fields are becoming more and more monocultural with regards to methods. And it's a sociological strength that there's a broad consensus that different questions require different methods, and we are generally open to lots of different ways to ask and address questions. So that's a really unique and powerful aspect of sociology that I love. So what I like best about culture is that it gives me this kind of capacious toolkit for thinking broadly about the issues that I care about. And I have ended up I think my work is about defending the expansiveness of that toolkit. And that seems to be where I engage most passionately with culture theory. In my view, other subfields in sociology have gotten bogged down in measurement fights, so that what they debate ends up at quite a distance from the heart of their substantive interest. I'm looking at you, stratification. While I care about where we are getting with our about what we are getting with our methods, I strongly favor a heterogeneous approach to culture, such as, for instance, was outlined by this great article that I've discovered fairly recently, 3 years after it was published, by Simco and Oleg, my colleague, in AJCS. In that terrific piece, they note that culture scholarship evolved into 2 dominant strains, with practice-based approaches like Swidler's toolkit and Bourdieu's habitus focused on how culture shapes action, and discourse-based approaches like the Strong program, for example, focused on how culture creates meaning. And they look at this bifurcation and they write, both ideas and habits are cultural, and our cultural theory must be able to handle both. And I just think that's fabulous. What I wish culture scholars always kept in mind is that there's a distance between the culture that people know as ideals and how they understand and narrate and experience their own lives. And the distance between that often requires kind of effortful cultural reconciliation work that is signaled, that is coded in emotional cues and can be very painful. And it's basically invisible to researchers unless we make space for that contradiction and emotional compromise in the cultural analysis of talk. So these kind of contradictions and compromises, that's really, if there is a unifying theme in my work, that is the unifying theme. I consider my overall subject matter the traps, thank you, Derron, that contemporary cultures lay for their inhabitants, particularly the space between economic life and social relationships, and how people kind of manage the space there, or the contradictions there. So in my first book, for example, in Longing and Belonging, I talked about how kids kind of creatively interpret and reinterpret the meanings of not having, when having was a passport to their social inclusion. And then I wrote The Tumbleweed Society, which looked at how adults who had been laid off kind of managed their feelings of betrayal inside a culture that kind of demanded this kind of neoliberal, kind of insouciance. And they used that to kind of spur themselves to action, but they also felt betrayal. So how did they manage the way they couldn't necessarily corral their feelings the way they were supposed to? So my research is kind of really about when we make theoretical space for what people do with talk, we can see culture as this kind of emotionally laden practice and meaning in kind of feedback loops of signal and struggle. In my current project, what I'm doing right now, and actually in a book that's coming out in June, I work with the example of the automation of humane interpersonal work. How is it sold to us? And what is that work? That's like therapy, teaching, primary care, massage therapy, chaplains, lots of different kinds of work. And I think about how is that sold? How is that automation sold to us? And how is it experienced by practitioners? And I kind of document how technologists or advocates of this AI and automation in these areas use culture to justify their work. And then I think about and I look at what culture does to the socio-emotional AI uses and what happens when it's deployed. And I also evaluate how culture figures in like the practitioners' responses to these challenges. So culture is kind of in all over this project in multiple ways. I find a bunch of different things, but among the things that are interesting is that there's all these unheralded, unintended consequences of AI in socio-emotional jobs that pose dilemmas for these practitioners. One of that is the erasure of their work. It makes it kind of invisible. The second is this kind of expansion of what I call data primacy, the requirement that they do a lot of data collection. And the third is this kind of new demand to prove their humanness. And I call these are all costs of the kind of relentless movement of AI and apps and robotics into this interpersonal emotional work, even though many pundits, the New York Times, the New Republic, all these different people have called this kind of work the last human job. And that is actually the title of my book, The Last Human Job. So I look at how providers kind of navigate and critique and defy these changes and how these struggles are often, once again, signaled by this kind of emotional anguish or alienation. And speaking about culture, without a kind of variegated model that allows us to take talk seriously as both meaning and practice, these efforts, these struggles are invisible. And the study of culture benefits when we can kind of effectively grapple with the struggles that people show us in deeds and in words. So I also have some recent work on resonance, which Sarah Masseri and I have recently used to weigh in on another different methodological debate about unmasking and about fact-checking in ethnography. And we actually argue that these reforms threaten what ethnography does well. And in elaborating what that is, like what ethnography does well, we discuss McDonnell et al., their great article on pragmatic resonance. And we think that that's a great article. They've kind of moved the ball forward in terms of what is resonance, cultural resonance. But we think that actually there is not enough room for ambivalence and contradiction there. And we offer up another different model of what we call textured resonance to make space for the complexity, the paradoxes, that actually that's what ethnography is really good at. And we say that that leads to a kind of haunting when an ethnography won't let you go. And that haunting is a vital kind of cultural resonance that we believe is what ethnography is prized for, and also it's what's put at risk by these reform efforts. So most of my explicitly focused cultural work seems to have been kind of hitched to the methodological wagon, but I view these efforts as defending the kind of wide and varied cultural toolkit from which our field benefits. And while my books have taken me from different fields, like my first one, consumption, childhood, family, and then my second one, like work, gender, emotions, and then now my third one, technology, media, knowledge, with work and emotions kind of all the way throughout. But anyway, culture has really been a constant companion, an underlying thread that has captured social processes that matter. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm glad I did not plan on putting Allison last for that particular awesome meta overview, but wow, guys, this is a wonderful positive outcome. So with that, I want to say we have about 20 minutes left, and I have gotten to interface with these fabulous scholars via email. So what I would like to do is have us all give them a huge round of applause, thank them for their thoughts, for their contributions, for the whole, like you said, huge variety of work that we just got to witness in the last hour. And then I'm going to open it up to any and every one of our participants. So if you have questions, throw up that hand, throw it in the chat, and I'll try to adjudicate order as well as possible. But right now I see Zawadi, so I'm going to hand it over to her.
Hi, thank you so much. This was really, really fun to hear about your different projects and the different areas that you're bringing cultural sociology into. I'm also someone who brings culture in who was not trained in the area. And I just wanted to acknowledge and ask about something that I experienced as a junior scholar coming into this space, which is how do you navigate all of the vocabulary, all of the lingo, right? Thinking, even if you're just picking a very narrow lane, right? Like the behavior and decision-making literature, right? There's all kinds of different terminology that's in that space. And I know for me, it was very intimidating when I first came into it. And at first I was like, yeah, I can't do this. This is no, like, what's the difference between a repertoire and a script and a frame? And I'm just really confused right now and I don't know where to go, right? So I'm curious about what advice you would give to junior scholars who are in that boat and trying to navigate the lingo of the space.
I can go, but other people can go if they want. I'll just go a little bit and then other people can chime in. Great question, really good question. And speaking as a kind of fellow fox, not hedgehog, if you're familiar with those two different distinctions, not sure. Okay, sorry. Foxes go from, interesting bush to interesting bush, and they have breadth, and hedgehogs really know their burrow. So if I'm kind of speaking to you as someone who is interested in kind of speaking to multiple audiences and using multiple toolkits, kind of not necessarily just one. So yeah. So I love that question. My first response was, it's all about audience, like who are you speaking to, and will dictate how fluent you have to be, you know what I mean? But then as you kept talking, I was like, but what you're really trying to do is you're trying to kind of doff your hat, like kind of give some respect to people who are in the field doing this work without like kind of saying, well, it doesn't matter. You want to say, okay, just tell me, like, what I should be using here or whatever. So I guess I would say, I would still say it's audience that is going to dictate how far you have to go down into that burrow to figure out exactly how to navigate it, but also that I guess I would characterize your question as trying to chart a path between doing respect to what's there without getting bogged down in their potentially needless skirmishing. And you're, as a scholar, you're allowed to have an opinion about whether or not a skirmish is needless. And and I say this, tentatively, but that you're doing a favor to your readers, especially your readers who are not maybe in the borough completely, who are just like, just tell me what I need to know about this to be able to think smart about what you have to say, And I guess I would just say, like, feel confident. If this feels like a needless skirmish, you don't have to use the word needless, but you can just be like, there's a big debate that I'm not going to touch here. Like there are ways to kind of not engage, and you can just go slip on right on by. And I just want to kind of pay some respect to the tricky and sensitive navigation that your question reflects without necessarily offering a big solution.
That's great. Do other panelists have items to add? I do love this reference and move on. I do think one of the things I always talk about in my work is one piece of work can't do everything. So we're going to do this, this, and this, and like limitations and the rest of it. Sorry about it.
If I may, I really, really liked what Allison had to say before, and couldn't agree more. I suppose if you find yourself moving away from being more of a fox to being more of a hedgehog in a specific area of raising questions, whereas for instance, all my work, despite the subfields I might engage with, I'm consistently thinking about race from a cultural perspective, consistently. And so for me, there's certain key debates around the culture of poverty, around the model minority myth that will keep coming up across different spheres of the literature. And it's really important for me to understand why it's the case, and critically, how it shows up in clandestine forms, for instance, when speaking about matters of social class. So one of the great challenges for me was there's a key text I won't name here, a key text that nearly every sociologist of education has to read in graduate school, right? But Leighton, despite the celebration of this book for what it means, was trafficking a set of assumptions quietly about ethno-racial groups, right? That the work he was doing around class liberation, particularly on the working classes, was also about marginalizing ethno-racial groups. So unless you're familiar with the debates around the cultural poverty thesis, and there's so many scholars who've done wonderful work on this and continue to do wonderful work on this, the reason I bring this up, Zawadi, is that we have to be careful not to fall into those pits, as it were, and suggest or seem as though we're not invested or even reproducing the very things that the harms of the past. I think that sort of historical literacy in the field, to the extent that you're moving away, once again, from being a fox to more of a hedgehog, where you find yourself coming back to the same area, familiarizing yourself with those debates, how they're racialized, and how, in order to be clear about what harms you ought to avoid as you advance your knowledge. Hope that's helpful.
Edna, Nolanil, yes, I see that your hand is up.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I just want to say thank you to all the panelists. I'm so excited. I don't even know where to start, but I'm not gonna like take up all the time asking like a bunch of questions. But my main questions are kind of for Derron and Pamela about kind of your work and like where's the demarcation line between like race and primitive accumulation and capitalism, and how those kind of buoy those perspectives when you view things. And for Derron specifically, I'm Ghanaian and I have Ghanaian parents, and in the context of our ideas about education, there was a lot of talk about, self-selecting out from the larger racial whole. So something I really see now is like more of a sub-hierarchies within the Black ethnic group, where Blacks of different diasporic backgrounds, like Africans, Caribbeans, and are trying to separate themselves from African Americans, be it in the United States or whatever dominant group they have in their host country that they're in, and trying to be better, seen as better, and a different kind of Black, a better Black, a model minority Black, if you would say. And kind of in your work with Caribbean students in the UK and the United States, how they navigated that kind of like a very thin line between like being with your race, but also being separate of your race in education, especially when it comes to attainment and separating yourself out. And for Pamela, I listened to a very interesting series yesterday. I think it was through Brandeis's series about violence, has no borders, about Caribbean women and Afro-Caribbean women, and kind of violence against them and how that's portrayed and transmitted in the media. And I want to see if you can talk a little bit about the language around that, because the question also came up that I had was, where do you draw the line between like if you're Latinx or if you're Afro-Latino, and how are your stories told when things happen, because of the process of kind of like wiping out race that happened in Latin America, which wasn't so much the case in the United States, where it was like everybody is like mestiza or mestizo, but it actually obscured the different struggles that different racial categories were going through. Yeah, so that's kind of like, I know that was a whole lot at once, but
Pamela, would you like to share first?
Yeah, sorry, there was a question at the beginning and a question at the end for me, and I'm trying to like reconcile what the two of them were because I forgot the one at the beginning. Do you mind repeating it?
yeah, so it's kind of like where the demarcation line is between identity. If you want to say like, what identity do you have to focus on to be seen, or your narrative to be told through?
Yeah. So what identity do you have to focus on, like when you're sort of in these contestations specifically?
Yeah, and also in the research that like you do when you're doing Afro-Latinas, like where are they sitting, or where are they situating when they have to pick like, so am I Black or am I Afro-Latina, and like how people see them and how their like stories are being told.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the stories that I would get, and a lot of I think what I'm trying to put forward in my own work is that there are multiple lines, and the ways that my respondents deploy particular identities depends a lot on the context that they're in. And what I found is that a lot of them are very strategic about which ones they deploy and when, partially out of necessity, or they feel it's out of necessity. So for example, like I recall one who described that in certain spaces, she really, really downplays her Dominicanness and she does not speak Spanish. But then in other contexts, when she's around other Dominicans or other Latinx people, she really plays up the fact that she does know Spanish and she is an Hispanic person. And part of that comes from the very fact that Afro-Latinidad is erased in Latinx spaces. So there's sort of extra lengths that my respondents have to go through to prove themselves in both contexts. And for them, ideally, they would be able to live out all facets of their identity and have them be equally sort of respected and represented in all of the spaces that they encounter. But due to the fact that Latinx spaces tend to be very anti-Black, tend to particularly erase the experiences of Black Latino women, especially, but Black Latinx people overall, there's extra sort of hoops to jump through that they feel that they have to prove. I mean, I think that the next step of this, or like the next question that sort of arises is like, I would love to sort of see like what those tests actually sort of look like. Like I have people's stories of things that happened before, but like what does that actually look like in interactions? I don't know. That's a different research question. But it depends on context. It depends on where they are and who they're with, and what part of their identity they feel is most salient in particular spaces, and which part of their identity they feel is they have to defend more in particular spaces, or the ones that sort of pop up more, if that makes sense, or that demarcate more in different contexts.
Thank you for that, Pamela. And then Edna, to your question, which I think requires a new paper to address fully, I'll do my best to sort of be as succinct as possible. There are two things I try to do in my work. One is to push past the national blinders that often suggest that what is experienced by one group is solely about what's going on in the United States, or solely about what's going on in Britain. By pushing past those national boundaries, we get to understand the global transnational architecture of inequality, in my context, particularly of race and racism. A way to concretize that for you in the fourth chapter of my book, I talk about how, on one hand, you could look at the challenge here as, you know, in New York City, it's about Caribbean students distancing themselves from African Americans. And in the UK context, where the Black Caribbean students were actually distancing themselves from from Black working class students, Black working class Caribbean students, you could easily say it's just a matter, or more precisely, there was this group called Yardies. These are recent immigrant, working class, low income Caribbean folks who are often deemed uncouth and outside the sort of norms of the British cultural polity, as it were. So on one hand, you could just say it's about African Americans in New York City. On the other hand, you could just say that it's about Yardies in London. But what the comparison allows us to see is that this is really about a struggle for Black working class people, as they're the ones across the two national contexts. The folks that are being demoted in the New York City context are working class African Americans. And the ones who are being demoted in the London context are working class Black Caribbean people. This is about a working class struggle in some respects, whereas we get lost in this sort of diaspora wars and these ethnic conflicts which miss the larger global picture. So the first thing I try to do is push past the sort of national blinders by calling our attention to the global and transnational architecture of race and racism. But I also want to be really clear, and I really tried hard at this in my book. I did not want folks to only think that this was just about infighting among Black people. I didn't want them to think that this was just about ethnic conflicts among Blacks. Permit me to be a bit more blunt and straightforward here. A whole host of groups do this too, right? I could walk you through how this distancing strategy is a class strategy that white folks use amongst themselves. And I don't need to marshal the degree of language, right? But we only tend to think of it or elevate it when we're talking about racially minoritized people, as if to suggest that there's something pathological about Black and brown people, why there would consistently be this infighting. This is about a struggle for power that various groups marshal, but often the literature only focuses on that conflict amongst people of color. So those are just two quick examples of the things I'm trying to push back against. That this is not just about what's happening amongst people of color. Groups across the world in the struggle for power and the struggle for greater resources end up challenging each other, pushing each other, struggling for those few resources. The challenge is not to pay attention to those people, but the fact that there are few resources. That is what we needs to pull us together to say, how do we have a more just, more equal, a fairer world and society? I hope that proves helpful, Edna.
Yes, that does. Thank you very much. And I agree. My question is I didn't want to focus on the infighting, but I think that the idea that, there are finite resources is also a big lie, a systemic lie. Like there are enough resources. It's just the access to those resources are limited and controlled in very specific avenues. And so minoritized groups can only take certain avenues to those power differentials. And that's why there's infighting. But that's like the larger patriarchy of like capitalism and class.
Yeah, and infighting for whom? Bringing our attention back to the global struggles, to go back to what you mentioned, Pamela, about the weight of chattel enslavement, about the enduring legacies of racial capitalism, bringing back to those structures which have structured in society a limited set of resources to which minoritized groups, racially minoritized groups now have access. Right? And racially privileged groups have inordinate or disproportionate access, right? So it's going back to those historical factors, which for me is why I'm always going to be a huge fan of Stuart Hall, because he does it so powerfully. You think this is just about a national context. You think this is just so simple. And he's able to bring history and politics into the analysis of culture in a way that I think it's necessary for what we need to continue to do.
This has been excellent. Do we have any other questions, or should we end on this extremely positive note of the things that pull us together and the common fights we share? I'm doing the teacher thing where I sing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star in my head to make sure I don't cut anyone off who has a question. Okay, well, I have 1:59, so I'm going to give you guys 1 minute of your life back, and I want us all to give a huge round of applause to these wonderful panelists. Thank you all so much for sharing your insights with us. I know I have a whole reading list that I'm really excited to go look at now, and so grateful for these awesome connections. And I will also throw in the chat real quick a little ad for panel 2, which is going to be on March 14th. It's called Culture on, in, and Around the Body. And Michael, who is here with us today, is going to be helping to moderate that as well. So thank you all so, so much, and have a happy rest of your Thursday. Appreciate all of this thoughtfulness.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.